Good evening and a warm welcome to St Andrews. It is great to be able to welcome you here this evening for this evening of poetry, painting and psalms entitled Songs in the Night. Do come forward. There are some spaces here at the front for those that don't yet have seats. And I hope you will have in your hands a glass of something nice or some coffee or tea. They're all available at the back, so please do make sure you have one in your hand. And if you'd like to donate towards the cost of those, then there's a basket just at the back. Well, a warm welcome to you who have joined us here in the building, and those of you joining us online as well. My name is Dan, and I'm the vicar here at St Andrews, and it's a privilege to welcome our three contributors this evening. Malcolm Guite is a poet and a priest, and Life Fellow of Girton College in Cambridge. His books include The Sounding of the Seasons, 70 Sonnets for the Christian Year, and Mariner, A Voyage with Samuel Taylor Coleridge. In 2023, he was awarded the Archbishop Lanfranc Award for Education and Scholarship by the Archbishop of Canterbury. He also has a YouTube series called A Spell in the Library, which I'm told now has some 130,000 followers. So I'm guessing that Malcolm is probably the most popular here this evening. Roger Wagner is an artist and poet, an honorary fellow of Lincoln College, Oxford. His books include The Penultimate Curiosity with Andrew Briggs, The Nearer You Stand, The Book of Praises, and his new book of poems and images, The Farther Away. And that was trailed recently in an article in The Spectator magazine, which indicated that he would be talking about it this evening. He has two one-man exhibitions at the Ashmolean Museum, and there's a permanent collection of his work at the Faith Museum in Bishop Auckland. And there is also a standalone piece of his work in the prayer room just there. Professor Susan Gillingham is Emeritus Professor of the Hebrew Bible at Oxford and Emeritus Fellow of Worcester College. The Psalms have been a consistent subject of her research, and her many books on the subject include the 3-volume study, Psalms Through the Centuries, and a 1-volume commentary for Penguin Short Classics for a readership of all faiths and none, illustrating how the Book of Psalms might also be termed a universal classic. And they are our three speakers this evening. I remembered my songs in the night. I remembered my songs in the night. That verse from Psalm 77 is the title of this evening, which is going to consist of two halves. The first half will be a poetry reading by Malcolm and then Roger. Then we'll have a 10-minute break, during which refreshments will continue to be served. And then in the second half, Malcolm and Roger will be joined by Sue for a discussion of the Psalms. During lockdown, in the COVID season, Roger, Malcolm, and Sue were all working on books related to the Psalms. And into that situation of lockdown, they began a podcast series of conversations on the Psalms, of which this is the last, or at least the last of Series 1. And so we'll begin tonight with poetry and with Malcolm Guite.
Well, thank you very much for that kind invitation. It was a great pleasure to be in Oxford again. And it's wonderful for the three of us to get together properly in the flesh rather than on these flat Zoom screens, and a pleasure to share that three-way conversation with you. You'll hear a bit more in a moment in a poem of mine, which Roger illustrated about flat Zoom screens. But since the book of Psalms is a common inspiration for all three of us, and we'll be sharing more about that in the second half, I thought I'd open with the little riff I wrote on the first two Psalms, but I'm thinking of particularly of Psalm 1, Beatus Vir, blessed is the man. I'll open with it by way of welcome. But just a quick little backstory on it. That first day of lockdown, when suddenly the night before the Prime Minister had come on and said, stay at home, and then said we'd be allowed out for exercise once a day. You know, you had your hour of exercise. And we had 2 greyhounds, so they needed more than that. So it meant my wife and I couldn't even walk out together, but I took the morning shift, walked out. And I had felt for a long time that I needed a deep dive into the Psalms. And what better time than to begin it now? So I remembered vaguely, in his law doth he exercise himself day and night, from Psalm 1. So I set off with my little Coverdale Psalter and began eccentrically reciting the Psalms aloud as the dogs pulled me on. And then I had this really weird idea, as we all did. We all went slightly crazy in lockdown. I was standing on a little bridge over the River Granta, admiring one of my favorite trees, a great chestnut with roots that came down nearly to the water. And I thought, oh, you know, this is Psalm 1. He should be like a tree planted by the waters. That's lovely. I might write a poem about that. And then I'd been reading John Donne's little sequence of sonnets called La Corona. I guess the word corona was in the air. And a corona is where the last line of the first poem is the first line of the next poem, and the last line of that poem is the first line of the next. And then what makes it a corona or crown is that the last line of the final poem is the first line of the first poem. And John Donne does it very beautifully with 7 sonnets, all addressed to Christ, going from the Annunciation to the Ascension. And I stood on this bridge and thought, why don't I do that, but with the Psalms? So like I'd have 150, and it'd be like a prayer diary through the Psalms, which was a bit crazy, but I did it. And it meant that I couldn't begin the journey and write the first line of the first poem until I'd read the final Psalm again and thought about where we will come to what glory we will arrive, with what praise. And I'm glad I did that, because it's a bumpy ride through the Psalms. It's quite good to kind of have a sneak peek at the ending, and you know, thank God it doesn't end with Psalm 88. So I'm going to read you the poem, the very first poem, which begins with the line with which the whole sequence ends. And then I'm going to, just to show you how it works, I'm going to read you the one on Psalm 2. So we go from blessed is the man to Psalm 2, which is why do the heathen rage? Here we go. Beatus Vir. Come to the place where every breath is praise, and God is breathing through each passing breeze. Be planted by the waterside and raise your arms with Christ beneath these rooted trees who lift their breathing leaves up to the skies. Be rooted too, as still and strong as these, open alike to sun and rain. Arise from meditation by these waters. Bear the fruit of that deep-rootedness. Be wise in the tree's long wisdom. Learn to share the secret of their patience. Pass the day in their green fastness and their quiet air. Slowly discern a life, a truth, a way where simple being flowers in delight. Then let the chaff of life just blow away. So that seemed like a good place to start lockdown. That tree's not going anywhere, and neither am I. I'm going to stay rooted. But this is where it went with the next one. Got to be the same line, remember. Why do the heathen rage? Then let the chaff of life just blow away. The cynic scoffer and the evil troll, the hunters and the haters who hold sway in raging Twitter storms, the ones who scroll through hate and hit lists in their tiny rage, are dust upon the mirror of your soul. Blow them away, the idols of this age, and let their fury settle in the mire. Uncap your pen and open a clean page. For now the Lord will give you your desire and set you high upon his holy hill. He draws you to the garden through the fire, back to the fountain whence those waters spill that christened you as his beloved child, that you may find your peace in his goodwill. So that gives you a flavour, and we'll be coming back to that in the second half as one particular one later. It wasn't the only thing I did in lockdown. It's like, what did you do in your holidays? I think none of us quite knew how serious this was going to be. And for some of us who didn't like the daily commute, we thought, this is wonderful. I can work from home. You know, I can spend time in the garden. I shall this be very good. And so we began with almost a false sense of ease, and this was only going to be temporary. Then gradually it became more and more serious. Now, I have always loved Edmund Fitzgerald's beautiful version of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, the Persian poem. And he did a particularly beautiful... My mother loved that poem, and she quoted it all the time. And all the wonderful verses of it. It begins, awake for morning in the bowl of night, has flung the stone that puts the stars to flight. And lo, the hunter in the east has caught the Sultan's turret in a noose of light. And there's wonderful bits about how nice it is to be in a garden with your beloved. You know, here with a loaf of bread beneath the bough, a flask of wine, a book of verse, and now beside me, singing in the wilderness. Wilderness is paradise, and how wonderful. Lots of praise of wine. But then there's some struggle in it as well. And I thought maybe I could do a sort of, light reply, a kind of new Rubaiyat. And I would use the same meter and rhyme scheme and so on. So I began this, and Roger came to know about it. I think I was posting it on my blog or something. And Roger got in touch with me and said, oh, you know, those beautiful 19th century editions of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, and even more so, the original medieval Persian manuscripts, all had delicate illustrations. You know, maybe I could do some illustrations. I've got some special paper, which I think was it from Persia? Yeah, and so he began to make these illustrations, and we gradually, you know, were making a work together. But of course, as we know, things went on, and it was terrible, you know, the death toll rising. And by the end of the poem, it had become an elegy particularly for the care workers, for those who were on the front line in the hospitals, taking the biggest risks, sometimes losing their own lives in the work to try and save others. And I felt something very Christ-like in that. So by the time I got to the end, we thought we'd got to do something more serious with this. So we made a limited edition. It was originally 600 copies, but we've got a few more now. And we have given the entire profits of that and of any we sell tonight to the Care Workers Charity, and it raised a reasonable amount. I'll read you, I'm just going to read you 3 of the little sections from this. You'll see the nice light-hearted start, and then there'll be something we all probably had to learn, another meaning of the word Zoom. Something about that, but then we'll have the final bit, which I'll tell you more about. So here, I think we can see an image of the first of the images so this is to go with my first of my sets of quatrains, which you'll see are all rather positive about the new way of living, and then we'll sort of see. So here's the first of the quatrain sequences, beginning with the same word that the Rubaiyat begins with. Awake to what was once a busy day, when you would rush and hurry on your way, snatch at your breakfast, start the grim commute, but time and tide have turned another way. For now, like you, the day is yawning wide, and all its old events are set aside. It opens gently for you, takes its time, and holds for you whatever you decide. This morning's light is brighter than it seems. Your room is raftered with its golden beams. The bowl of night is richly filled with sleep, and dawn's left hand is holding all your dreams. Your mantel clock still sounds its silver chime. The empty page invites an idle rhyme. This quarantine has taken many things, but left you with the precious gift of time. Your time is all your own, yet not your own. The rose may open and be overblown. So breathe in this day's fragrance whilst you may. To each of us the date of death's unknown. Then settle at your desk, uncap your pen, and open the old manuscript again. The empty hours may tease you out of thought, yet leave you with a poem now and then. So that was the opening. The next one, I'm happy to say, was all about the pleasure of drinking wine. We can probably see the picture from that. I won't read you the whole of that. I have a little hut, if we can change to the next picture now. I have a little hut at the bottom of my garden. It is literally a shed, but I call it the Temple of Peace. And perhaps because I mentioned it was the Temple of Peace, Roger actually gave me an entire actual classical temple, for me to drink my wine. I'll just read you the last two verses that go with that picture. So with the poets, let me praise the vine and pledge my absent friends in vintage wine, sensing sometimes the savor at my lips speaks of a love both human and divine. And when I come to taste my life's last drop, when all that flowed in me comes to a stop, then let me see my Savior pledge his love. Come close to me and help me drink the cup. So we were all contemplating our mortality. Now, let's go on to the next picture, because this will tell you, Zoom. This is my Zoom poem. And what I loved, I had no idea what Roger would do, but this, I think, was brilliant. He's turned that, irritating multi-squared Zoom screen into an iconostasis. That's what it is. And he's done icons, all of us as icons. It's absolutely wonderful. And you know how it is that you had the option to be invisible? You could turn your camera off and just your initials, And there's all this thing about whether students were allowed to do that, with the classes. So there are two persons, or two visitors who've turned off their cameras, and look at what the two letters are. Alpha and Omega. The invisible God present with us. That's wonderful. So here's the poem to which Roger was responding. Some days I am diverted by a call, the soft computer chime that summons all to show a face to faces that we meet. Mirages, empty mirrors on the wall. Alas, that all the friends we ever knew, whose lives were fragrant and whose touch was true, can only meet us on some little screen, then zoom away with scarcely an adieu. We share with them the little that we know, these galleries of ghosts set in a row. They flicker on the screen of life a while, but some have left the meeting long ago. We used to stroll together on the green, who now divide the squares upon the screen. The faces of our friends, so far apart, tease us with tenderness that might have been. Someday, we'll break the bread, we'll pour the wine, and meet and kiss and feast beneath the vine. Till then, we'll sweeten solitude with verse, and yearn through pain, and watch each day decline. So you can see we're kind of getting into something a little more serious. This feels very boomy and echoey to me. I don't know if it's sounding that to you. Maybe we could turn it down a bit, and if it's possible to take any echo of it, that would be great. So we carried on, and eventually I began to think, as we all did, not only about our own mortality, but of all those people we were losing, and often without the tenderness of a personal goodbye. And I became more aware of the heroism of the frontline workers of every kind. That was the time when we were applauding, do you remember? So when I brought this sequence to a close, I wanted to close it with elegy and prayer. And again, Roger responded really beautifully, and it was having written this last bit that I realized if we published it, we should do it for the Care Workers Charity. But there's one other thing that came. I was putting this up on my blog as I wrote it, and it was being read fairly widely, and I was beginning to get emails precisely from nurses in hospitals, people in care workers, in carers, in old people's homes, all these people saying, you know, that they were enjoying these poems. So I really felt I must write something that's also for them, which I did, and it's the last of this sequence that I'll read. But it had a nice follow-up. It had obviously come to be known a bit in that sort of community. And towards the end of lockdown, a little after, I had a letter from the Bishop of London saying that they were going to do a memorial service in St. Paul's. They used to do that every year for folk in the NHS, and particularly in the two big hospital trusts in London, St. Mark's and St. Thomas's, I think, you know, that had died in that previous year. But this was going to be a special one because they hadn't been able to meet him, because obviously so many had died. And she asked me if I would preach on that occasion, and added, "We want you to read the last part of the Quarantine Quatrains for us in St. Paul's." And it was an amazingly moving thing for me to be able to do it. So you perhaps, you can imagine St. Paul's as well as St. Andrew's. If we go through the pictures now, just a little bit. So that's me listening to birdsong, and we'll have the next one. This was, do you remember how kind of strange it was that Piccadilly, this is a poem about how deserted places were. The next one, that's about the animals returning. And now we'll come to the final slide. Okay, so 7, this is the elegy. At close of day, I hear the gentle rain, whilst experts on the radio explain mind-numbing numbers rising by the day, ciphers of unimaginable pain. Each evening they announce the deadly toll, and patient voices calmly call the roll. I hear the numbers, cannot know the names. Behind each number, mind and heart and soul. Behind each number, one beloved face, a light in life whom no one can replace. Leaves on this world a signature, a trace, a gleaning, and a memory of grace. All loved and loving, carried to the grave, the ones whom every effort could not save. Amongst them, all those carers whose strong love bought life for others with the lives they gave. The sun sets, and I find myself in prayer, lifting aloft the sorrows that we share, feeling for words of hope amidst despair. I voice my vespers through the quiet air. O Christ, who suffers with us, hold us close, deep in the secret garden of the rose. Raise over us the banner of your love, and raise us up beyond our last repose. So when I read that last verse in St. Paul's, I always felt like somebody else had written that. It's this kind of strange feeling that it kind of existed on its own. Now, I must just do one or two more. I'll try and give you some samplings of other things. Now, one of the things about being a poet is, like every artist, you love your medium. I don't know. I've never really had a conversation with Roger about paint or the metals that you use or anything. But I think you love your medium. You care about it. And if you're a poet, your medium is language. You really care what becomes of words. You want to see language well used. You don't want to see certain words traduced and cheapened and used in false ways. And you love the particularity and variety of your language. So I'm going to read you a couple of poems that are about that love of language, and are kind of slightly sort of alarmed or warning poems. So the first poem is called A Lament for Lost Words, and it's very famous now because it was made famous by Rob. Yeah, sorry. Well, God, it was last. I thought it was last. No. He wrote the Lost Words. Spelled it landmarks. Thank you, Rob McFarlane. Yeah. Jet lag. So Rob McFarlane did a review once in The Guardian of the then Oxford Junior Dictionary, the new edition, from which a whole series of words had been culled to make room for the new words, because it's a physical finite form. And Rob just noticed a certain kind of consistency of range and tenor from the deleted words, the words which were no longer regarded as essential for those bright 12 to 15-year-olds to know. And in the article, which he listed them in alphabetical order. And the poet in me immediately pricked up his ears because I felt like it was a poem in itself. So there were words like acorn, adder, ash, beech, bluebell, buttercup, catkin, conker, and it was extraordinary. Right the way through to otter, pasture, willow. So he was quite rightly drawing attention to this. It wasn't complete wickedness on the part of Oxford, but it was simply that they'd used a machine to gauge the occurrence of these words in what was being read by their target audience. They'd been removed to make room for such important words as celebrity, chat room, upload. Of course, the irony was, young teens would know all the celebrity chat room out. They don't need the dictionary for that. But they might want to say, what's that lovely yellow flower? And be glad to look up the word buttercup. Anyway, eventually Rob himself did a beautiful book with illustrations redeeming the lost words. But in the very day I read the review, I wrote this lament, which I sent to him, which may have been a slight prompt to the beautiful book that he then produced. A Lament for Lost Words. To graceful names and lovely woods, farewell. To acorn, adder, ash. To beech and bluebell, farewell, old friends. I name you in my sonnet. Buttercup, catkin, conker, cowslip, cygnet. Farewell, your fields are brick, our books are barren. No dandelion or fern, hazel or heron. We'll go no more alone, no more together. The mountain thyme is gone, and gone the heather. The clinging ivy's gone, and soon to go the kingfisher's blue bolt, the mistletoe, nectar, newt, and otter, pasture, willow. To their last rites my muse comes footing slow. We'll hear no more the heavens scaling lark. We'll all go down together in the dark. Anyway, I'll finish now with something a little more upbeat. Sometimes words get hijacked, they get, as it were, kidnapped, and then they're reduced to a kind of servitude. So I would say that two beautifully related words have suffered that fate, and those are the words icon and window. Windows, both of which were kidnapped by Microsoft. These beautiful, sacred, related words. And the icon, which itself was a kind of window into heaven, was reduced to this squiggly little thing. And the windows, of which icons are a term, were turned into an operating system. So I wanted to write a poem which redeemed those two words. And I wrote it on the occasion that one of my poems destroyed a photocopying machine and got completely grounded up. And a woman came out of the office and accused me and said, your poetry is jamming my machine. And I thought, I thought that's such a great word, there's such a great line. I'm going to use that in a poem, which I wrote for her. And she was uncrumpling the paper and reading the poem. Anyway, so I wrote this poem, and I chose the villanelle as a form, because that is a form that literally photocopies itself. But I thought, I'll take this, here was this poor woman slaving over a screen, clicking on icons to open windows, and I wanted to restore those words. So I'll finish with this, which is snappily entitled, On Being Told My Poetry Was Found in a Broken Photocopier. My poetry is jamming your machine. It broke the photocopier. I'm to blame, with pictures copied from a world unseen. My poem is in the works. I'm on the scene. We free my verse, and I confess my shame. My poetry is jamming your machine. Though you berate me with what might have been, you stop to read the poem just the same. And pictures, copied from a world unseen, subvert the icons on your mental screen and open windows with a whispered name. My poetry is jamming your machine, for chosen words can change the things they mean and set the once familiar world aflame with pictures copied from a world unseen. The mental props give way on which you lean. The world you see will never be the same. My poetry is jamming your machine with pictures copied from a world unseen.
Thank you, Malcolm. It's a very hard poem to follow, that one. Well, it's always a great pleasure to come back to St Andrews. And Malcolm and Sue and I are very grateful to Dan and the church for hosting us here. It was actually 25 years ago that I and 4 other friends actually had an exhibition here in the church. If we can have it's actually after all, yes, there we are. My pictures were up here at the end. They were Ruth and Boaz and that sort of story. My friend Nick Mine here had his sort of sculptures in the body of the church where you are. Another friend, Mark Cazalet, had his paintings on one side, and Richard Kenton Webb had his paintings on the other side. And although the 4 of us had all sort of been in together in exhibitions, this was the first, and in fact, the only exhibition that we've all done together, just as us. And that was to celebrate the millennium. And we based it around a poem by the 17th century poet Thomas Traherne. We have the next picture, yes. It's called The Salutation, which just seemed a very appropriate sort of millennium poem. And that exhibition was actually the seed of an idea. After it, we decided that the 4 of us, and later joined by a 5th, the wonderful stained glass maker, Tom Denny, that we would actually meet together once a year and go on a sort of one-day pilgrimage to a place associated with a poet or painter. Because we only had one day, all the places had to be in reach. But then, a number of years ago, I went to Japan for the first time and was able to visit a cottage associated with another 17th century poet, Matsuo Basho. In the last years of his life, Basho had done rather what we were doing. He'd gone on a series of pilgrimages to places associated with poets and holy people, accompanied by various poet friends. And then he'd made these pilgrimages into sort of travel books that were interspersed with haiku poems by him and his friends. And the most famous of these is called The Narrow Road to the Far North. And I just had this idea, could I make our journeys into a similar kind of book of narratives and poems and pictures? And so I began the book, which is called The Farther Away. I begin this book in Japan with a visit to that cottage of Basho's. It's in the middle of a bamboo forest called Shimosaka. And Basho described it like this, he said it was a place where the heart can clear among the bamboo thickets of Shimosaka, for it is hushed in silence. Such is the laziness of my friend Kyorai, who owned the house, that his windows are covered with tall grass growing thick in the gardens, and his roofs are buried under the branches of overgrown persimmon trees. Basho had actually based his book on poems written much earlier by a monk called Saigo, who had written a sort of similar kind of thing. So Basho was basing it on Saigo, I was basing it on Basho, and I kind of used some of Basho's poems in my first poem. So we have the next picture. That's the Basho's hut, which I started painting in front of it and then finished later. The poem goes like this. In holy places, drenched in poetry, like pearls of dew that soak a dried-up path, you sit where Saigo sat beneath the tree. You stare at Matsushima's starlit seas. You reach at last the Shirakawa gate and sleep in wayside inns, besieged by fleas. As in a temple high on Huguro, within the southern valley where you lodge, a breath brings in the faintest scent of snow. So, hanging your new poems on old shrines and linking verses as old friends link arms, a breath of silence breathes within your lines. And when sick on the road, all journeys stop, along the dried-up path, across parched grass, through hazing heat, the dream still travels on, to where, within the Shimosaka wood, past green light filtering down through green bamboo, the house of fallen persimmons once stood, and stands there still, remote from rage and riot, a house in which a poet stared and wrote, surrounded by deep grass and deeper quiet. A Basho hut beneath a Basho tree. I dip my brush and on my paper see a holy place, dew-drenched in poetry. One of the pilgrimages we made was to Shoreham, the little village in Kent where the painter Samuel Palmer lived for a number of years. Palmer's friend, the painter Edward Calvert, described Shoreham as the Valley of Vision, a valley so hidden that it looked as if the devil had not yet found it. Nice description, and a group of painter friends who called themselves the Ancients used to come and stay with Palmer, sometimes bringing William and Catherine Blake up from London to visit. The next picture isn't actually the ancients, it's the moderns, it's the five of us who, all in our way, have been inspired by Parma. And we managed to discover the house in Shoreham where Parma and the ancients had first stayed. And that's the next picture. They called it Rats Abbey. Yes, and it was empty when we got there, and it was actually for sale, and it was completely overgrown, and it felt as if the ancients had just left. A holy place, dew-drenched in poetry, where thick cow parsley crowds the cottage walls and sunlight twisting down through tangled leaves lights footsteps in the pathway where it falls. Here, Calvert, Richmond, Giles, Linnell, Blake came down to Kent to find what Parma found, a door of heaven and an angel's gate where every field they trod was holy ground, where harvest moons lit flocks of sleeping sheep in valleys thick with vision as with wheat. A third pilgrimage we made was to the little village of Bemerton, just outside Salisbury, where the poet George Herbert lived. Herbert was a poet, but also, like Malcolm, a priest. The church is very tiny indeed. It's almost on a little kind of traffic island in Bemerton. But the vicarage is which is just opposite it, is rather bigger. And Herbert made the lawns of the vicarage into a physic garden, which was a kind of dispensary for the people in the village. I went to paint the vicarage is actually now lived in by the poet and novelist Vikram Seth, and he very kindly allowed me to go into the garden and to paint the vicarage. And so I found the furthest spot I could find. It's actually, the garden runs down to the River Nada, and there's an island which is part of his garden, which is on the Nada. So I went onto the island, the furthest part, and to then look back at the vicarage. I should have said that in the church in Bemerton, Herbert is actually buried under the altar there, and there's just a little tile saying GH 1653, and that's the only memorial. So anyway, I started painting, and quite often when I'm painting, I hum. My wife tells me this. I'm not usually aware of it, but apparently I do. On this occasion, I was just sort of, I had the vicarage was sort of quite in the distance. I started to paint, and I started to hum. It was, and I realized it was one of Herbert's hymns. Teach me, my God and King, in all things thee to paint, and in the trees that frame his home, to see an English saint. Is that the right? Yes, we'll have the next picture. You'll see the picture. Though all things may partake in what the poets dream, through what glass may a painter see what poetry has seen? Then softly in the river's sound you hear, with every ochre outline that you make, a friend beside you, speaking in your ear, you surely know the Lord is in this place. And surely, if the Lord is in this place, through all the garden, its whole breadth and length, you need no priceless glass to find his face. Just copy what you see without expense. So then you sit and frame what you can see, the river's music, always in your ear. First nettles, reeds, and then the framing tree that frames the house from which love swept out fear. Before the house, the physic garden, where once Herbert dug and tended his twin goals, a house of health beside a house of prayer, a cure of bodies in his cure of souls. The unseen church is where his songs were sung, both emblems now, a shepherd with his crook. The temple and its priest become as one, a single poem in a single book. So there, behind the house, beyond the trees, and where beneath the altar Herbert lies, you find that unpriced glass, and through it see a holy place, dew-drenched in poetry. We've made 2 pilgrimages to places associated with William Blake, one to the cottage at Felpham in Sussex, where he worked not very happily for a patron, and one to London, where you can at least see some of the places where he lived and worked. The house where he was happiest was in Lambeth. That no longer exists, and neither does the burnt-out ruin of the Albion steam mill, which was the first automated mill in London, and that he must have seen every day while he lived there. And that must have been the basis of the imagery of the dark satanic mills in his lyric Jerusalem, but also of the imagery of the looms of Locke and the water wheels of Newton and his long prophecy. I've always been fascinated by industrial imagery. When during lockdown, actually, again, one of these other projects in lockdown, I was asked to do a painting of the whole book of Revelation, which, as you can imagine, was a bit of a challenge. I remembered many years ago driving past the Port Talbot Steelworks and seeing it reflected in a body of water in front of it. And I began to think of the images in Revelation of Babylon and the New Jerusalem and the lion and the lamb. And that became a picture. And a poem kind of rose up out of the picture, which is called Sacred Allegory. I travelled roads from east to west and passed a mighty city where 1,000 arc lights lit the ground and smoking chimneys choked the air. I saw there in a prophecy as an unending city-state, an empire that engulfed the world. Its name was Babylon the Great. In that great city no birds sing, and in its streets no seed can flower. Its iron forges frame a world whose only currency is power. There none know what they serve or why, or with their choices what they choose, but each choice is a zero sum, where if I win, then you must lose. And that iron law twists every choice and binds each soul with chains of iron. Its walls of iron ring every land and seal off every road to Zion. But standing there upon a shore, I thought I saw the Lamb of God, a sacrifice already slain with whitest wool stained red with blood. And as I saw that powerless Lamb had suffered all that power could do, a breath of life breathed through the land, by which the whole world was made new. As with forgiveness, mercy, grace, the math of zero sum unwound, from wretched captives, naked, blind, the chains of iron fell to the ground. Not iron, but angels held their hand, as stepping by a crystal sea, within a figured dance they find an order in which all are free. Then all equations were reversed. The Lamb of God became a lion. The walls of iron were broken down, and pilgrims thronged the paths of Zion. And mirrored in that crystal sea, I saw the new Jerusalem, its walls and trees and shining towers, both here and now, and still to come. Well, I mentioned at the beginning that our exhibition here was based on a poem by the 17th century poet and clergyman, another poet and clergyman, Thomas Traherne. Traherne's writings were actually only rediscovered at the end of the 19th century, when some manuscripts were found on a book barrow in Whitechapel. And then, even more dramatically, in 1967, another of Traherne's leather-bound manuscript books was snatched smouldering from a burning rubbish tip in Wigan by a man looking for parts for his car. Such a wonderful story, that. Traherne describes how, as a child, it had seemed to him that the corn was orient and immortal wheat, which never should be reaped, nor was ever sown. I thought it had stood from everlasting to everlasting. And it began to look as if Traherne's writings were as imperishable as his cornfield. His words wouldn't burn. He was born in Hereford, and some years earlier, Tom Denny had been commissioned to produce 4 small Traherne windows. We have which are these, in Hereford Cathedral, which none of the 4 of us had ever seen before. They are astonishingly beautiful. If you haven't been to see them in Hereford, you ought to go. They're actually just at sort of a head height, so that you can really look at the details of them. And they're not only astonishingly beautiful, they wonderfully convey Traherne's transfigured view of the world. For me, though, one of the most moving parts of our visit to Hereford was seeing the medieval city walls and the places where the city gates had been, because it was through one of these gates that Traherne had looked as a child. The gates, he writes, were at first the end of the world. The green trees, when I first saw them through one of the gates, transported and ravished me. Their sweetness and unusual beauty made my heart to leap, and almost mad with ecstasy. They were such strange and wonderful things. I write in the book that the cars on the A49 didn't immediately provoke the same feelings. But as the traffic lights sort of blinked to green, I seemed just for a moment to see with the same eyes. The next picture. A gate, a door, a glimpse beyond the walls of all the choking traffic of our lives, a vision of the world before the fall, or out beyond the time of tears and sighs. The gate stands at the ending of the world, the great trees out beyond it, strange and new, quicksilvering the light which light winds turn, a depth of green against a depth of blue. A tree At the beginning of the world, a story before time, yet just begun. A depth of green against a depth of blue is like a seraph standing in the sun or in the ocean, in each stone and leaf, a voice within the depth of all delight, which warns until you go beyond yourself, you never will enjoy the world aright. Until in God, who makes the stars his jewels, you sing, rejoice, and find your true delight. As kings in scepters, misers in their gold, you never will enjoy the world aright. A gate, a door, a glimpse beyond the walls, beyond the choking traffic of the street, are seraphs scything fields of orient corn and harvesting the bright, immortal wheat. Well, this book begins in Japan, but it ends in Wales on a boat going to Bardsey Island. I'd actually hardly been, apart from that trip past Port Talbot, I hardly knew Wales at all until I got married, and Anne, who is Welsh, began to introduce it to me. One of our first expeditions to Wales was actually when our friends, who actually I think are here, William and Juliet, invited us to stay in their family house in Aberedu. I'd never been in such a house with a stream at the bottom of the river, and it was a most wonderfully soothing. I remember Wordsworth talking about the river that flowed along his dreams when he was a child. So it was a wonderful place. I haven't got the pictures of that there, but you can see them in the book. Juliet told us while we were there that their son and his jazz band were coming to stay in the house after we'd left to write some music there. And I just seemed to hear an edge of anxiety in her voice when she said that. So as I was sort of sitting by the river, I wrote this little sort of homily to the coming jazz band. If you come to Aberedu, by the route the sat-nav led you, to the grey stone house past which the river flows, and walk down steps that led you to the garden by the Edu, where the bluebell and the yellow poppy grows. If you come to Aberedu, do not bite the hand that fed you with carousals that the neighbours deprecate, but let the music of the Edu be the music that has led you to a music that our heart will educate. Our hearts will educate. Anyway, they were extremely well-behaved jazz bands. It was entirely unnecessary. But when we went on beyond that to the Welsh coast, we stopped at St. Hewin's Church in Aberdaron, and I'd never seen a church which was so close to the ocean, so that the graveyard is right on the edge of the beach, and all the tombs are sort of crusted with salt, and some of them are really ancient. There's a 6th century Roman presbyters who had introduced Christianity, and there's a wonderful grave that says, Senarchus the priest lies here with a multitude of the brethren. Hewin who the church is named after, was a cousin of Cadfan, who had built a monastery on the sacred island of Bardsey, which is 3 miles off the coast. And it became known as the island of 20,000 saints. And Bardsey, along with St. David's, became a great sort of centre of pilgrimage in Wales. although we'd been doing these sort of day-long pilgrimages for some time by now, I'd never really thought very much about the idea of pilgrimage before I went to Wales. But I began to, and I realized that the earliest description of something like a pilgrimage is the story of Elijah, which begins, we have the next picture, begins with him sort of sitting under a juniper tree wanting to die, when an angel gives him breakfast and tells him he's going to walk the whole length of Israel until he comes to the mountain of God, where after a whole series of dramatic events, he hears a still small voice, a silent voice, asking him what he's doing there. It's said that it was St. Augustine who coined the phrase solvitur ambulando, solve it by walking. And there's certainly a wisdom in that, because many people in the Middle Ages wanted to be buried among the 20,000 saints on Bardsey. And so people would come there often at the end of their lives. And on one trip to Wales, having looked in a mirror and been rather shocked by what I saw, as having heard Malcolm's villanelle, I decided I'd write my own villanelle to sort of comfort myself. And so this was a villanelle I composed walking along the Pembrokeshire coast on growing old. When first through thinning hair you see thin skin and feel the dreary avant-garde of age, then rise and go, new journeys must begin. For since the frame of youth has rusted thin, the time has come to leave its mind-forged cage when first through thinning hair you see thin skin. Once thrilled by downy hair on lip and chin, from all the pride of youth now disengage. Then rise and go, new journeys must begin, in which you seek a deeper song to sing that sets aside the sighing and the rage when first through thinning hair you see thin skin, to find repentance for each deep-grained sin, to take your place upon God's larger stage. Then rise and go, new journeys must begin. Your soul must learn to clap its hands and sing, to face the dreary avant-garde of age when first through thinning hair you see thin skin. Then rise and go, new journeys must begin. The Welsh name for Bardsey Island is Ynys Enlli, the Isle of Streams, or perhaps the Isle of Riptides, because the straits between Bardsey and the mainland are very treacherous, and pilgrims would often have to wait on the shore for many days before it was safe to make a crossing. So this last poem and the paintings which illustrate it will be part of an exhibition that I'm doing in Wales, actually later this year. And so as we go, we start with the first painting, and you'll just have to watch. I'll put my hand up as there's three paintings on this, and they'll appear as the poem goes on. So this is the last poem, and I'll end with this. The points from which our souls depart are finally threaded through the world at bus stops in the biting wind where lives and paper shift and swirl, on platforms in the grey of dawn where grey crowds crowd on every train, on trolleys left in corridors where grey-faced patients nurse their pain, at terminals where flight's side queues wait for their final gates to call, on icy pavements, lying still and crumpled from a stone-hard fall. Or crunching here upon the shore, the soul in flight and peregrine, as pilgrims set their face towards the isle the prayers of saints wore thin, transparent in the early light, as though a door was left ajar through which the gleams of paradise are now so near and yet so far. An island in a slate-dark sea, too rough for crossings yet to start. The wind must drop, the days must pass, to still the self, to calm the heart. Until a morning when you see the beauty of the world unfold, birds flying through deep golden skies, an island in a sea of gold. Thank you. In the series. Okay, so these three books are the books that the three of us wrote or were working on, at any rate, during lockdown. So on the far right is David's Crown, the book that Malcolm was talking about. On the far left is the Book of Praises, which was the book of Psalms that I was working on. But in the middle is, I think, volume 3 of the immense work that Sue was completing during lockdown. So perhaps, Sue, you could start by telling us about that.
Well, it amuses me that as Roger was exhibiting his first paintings here in the church, I was just starting on volume 1 of the Psalms. It's been a 25-year project. And that's because I am interested in what we call the afterlife of a text, of the Psalms in particular. So each psalm I'm looking at, not in terms of what went into how it got together, but how it was used afterwards, what's called reception, the reception of a psalm. But I'm not just interested in it as a sort of text with lots of commentaries and translations. I am interested in that, but not only. I'm interested in the way that it's sort of got this performing quality in liturgy, in drama, in film, in art and music and poetry, and social and political discourse too. Lots of that as we get into the middle of the 17th century and so on. So I'm interested in how it works beyond the text itself. And so the first one was published in 2008, and the next then in 2018, so it was just before lockdown. And then I had to embark on the last and the biggest one. And it covers 2,500 years of history, but really looking at it from after 2000, after the Christian church began. But I don't just do the Christian church. I'm passionate about the way the Psalms were received in Jewish tradition as well as Christian tradition. So it meant having to do a whole host of cultural history, trying to get a hang of not just my own Christian heritage, but the Jewish one as well. So it's the Jewish and Christian reception of the Psalms through all the stages of their history, East and West. What a project. And through music and art and poetry and so on. So this is where I came in contact with these two, because they'd heard of the work. And I suppose the thing I offer, if anything, to what's going on is that on the one hand, I take them back to the text, because after all, the text is something I have to read in Hebrew and Greek and Latin. You know, that's my job. I take them back, but also, I hope, I then try and give them a perspective. which takes them beyond the text, very much not just in the world of art and art and poetry, but obviously in terms of music and all the other things too. So if you're interested in how the Psalms have been received, then perhaps the best place to start is to dip into Volume 1, which was written long before this project started. Volume 3 is the last Psalms. It starts at Psalm, I can't even remember, Psalm 73, and then goes right to the end. So and you can dip in and out of one psalm and another, as we're going to do tonight.
So Malcolm, you've already told us a bit about the how David's crown started.
So, yes, I mentioned this to you a bit earlier about a slightly crazy idea, standing on the bridge. It didn't come from nowhere. In fact, my choice in lockdown to take the Book of Psalms out with me was a return to something I'd done earlier. I mean, I've always loved the Psalms, and I returned to my Christian faith as a student. I'd given it up in my mid-teens, but I came back to it in my final year at university at Cambridge. And obviously the Psalms featured so beautifully in College Chapel. You know, they're wonderful sung Psalms, and we were always using Coverdale, and I was already reading Coverdale's translation as part of the background, so-called, to English literature. In those days, if you wanted to read English at Cambridge, they sent you a reading list, and the first two books on the reading list, if you were to understand English literature, were the authorized version of the Bible and the Book of Common Prayer. And they were serious that you would read that, you know. And I found reading the Psalms in that was the beginning of a process that brought me back to Christ. So actually I have a kind of, I mean, I'm very aware of the different ways of reading, specifically Jewish ways of reading, but I have a kind of frank and almost unapologetically kind of Christocentric reading, in the sense that I think of the Psalms as Christ's own prayer book. I think of how he refers to himself of the Psalms. I think of the Psalms, one of the Psalms on his lips as he's dying. I think of all those you know, messianic Psalms. So I was very much taking a journey. But it was my second go because I, like Roger and his friends, I'm very interested in pilgrimage, and that's been important for me. I am also a Solve It by Walking person. And I did a pilgrimage from Holy Island, from Lindisfarne, to Melrose Abbey, which is the Cuthbert way. Cuthbert did it the other way around, from Melrose down to Holy Island. And Bede tells us that Cuthbert knew the entire Psalter by heart, and that it's his custom when he was on these long walks to recite it. So I recited the whole Psalter over 5 days, which was kind of quite a lot. It was like, 30 Psalms a day, essentially, 3 goes of 10, while I did this walk. And suddenly discovered what an amazingly outdoor book it is. You're walking along, you've lost your way, set me on a rock higher than I. You're walking at night, but the heavens declare the glory, and the high crags are a covering for the conies, and walking by still waters. The book came alive for me. So I had another go in lockdown. I've already mentioned the form of the Corona, which involves the last line of one poem as the first line of the next. I mentioned that I therefore needed to say that, to know that at the end of the journey of the Psalter, I would indeed come to the place where every breath is praise. That would be the last line. And then come to the place where every breath is praise would be the invitation. What I hadn't seen, and this is what the discipline of this particular poetic form, I hadn't really thought about, and I don't know as much as either of you will do historically, about the ordering of the Psalms. I know that we have 5 books, and I was brought up in the it's the kind of hymn book of the Second Temple or whatever. But I don't know what conscious human work or what hidden divine providence or work of the Spirit was involved in the sequencing of the Psalms. But I began to find them hugely moving, thinking about the order in which we sing them. And there's a particular point, of course. I mean, perhaps I should confess that I'm not very good at mathematics, but until I did this deep dive, it had never occurred to me that 23 comes after 22. That is to say that the Psalm of the Crucifixion precedes the Psalm in which we see that the shepherd will go before us through the valley of the shadow of death. That though I hadn't seen that sequence, I hadn't seen how what follows 24 is about resurrection and ascension. So I learnt a lot. But I also found expression in these psalms, and then in the poems I wrote, for not only the horrors of COVID, but all the other, massive struggles that were going on in the world. The killing of George Floyd, the riots and expressions of agony and injustice. I began to realize how much the Psalms were about the poor and about justice. So it was I thought it would take 2 or 3 years, but I got completely obsessed. My wife became a psalm widow and sort of put meals gingerly under the door of my writing hut, because I just went through, 4 or 5 psalms every day, read them last thing at night aloud, sleep on them, take them for my morning's exercise, take them for a walk, and then a whole day in my hut writing these prayerful responses. And it's made the Psalter for me. I mean, I really have, I felt I was given a gospel according to the Psalms.
Can I just add to that? Because I was ordained as a permanent deacon about 6 years ago. And now, of course, I have to read the Psalms exactly like he was, and to pray them in the daily office, psalm by psalm, day by day. Once we had a thing called a psalmathon where we read the entire Psalter in a day. And it's interesting when you start, as Malcolm said, when you start to look at the Psalms, each psalm, if you take and look at it carefully, is connected intimately with the next one, with various little words that come out. It may be strange words. I'm trying to think of obvious ones at the moment. I mean, obviously the words like justice and righteousness occur a lot, and you could say, well, that's just coincidence. But you can take sequences of psalms. Malcolm's made the good point about the death, in between Psalms 22 and 23. But again and again, if we were to look at Psalm 87 in the light of 88, we'd find a number of things, a number of specific words, in the English translation, not least, which link it. So not only 5 books, but it's like pearls on a string. Each psalm leads into another one. So that's why Malcolm's Corona meant so much to me, because it was actually doing what I've been trying to read, how I've been trying to read the Psalms.
In fact, the artist Rebecca Merry, who made the illustration for this, I was also aware of the connection of the Psalms to what then became the Rosary, because prayer beads were originally for counting off your 150 Psalms, and that's why there were 15 decades on a Rosary. And then the Marian praises became attached to that, and particularly for lay people that didn't have the whole Psalter available to them. So Rebecca put in the beads on the cover. There are roses, but there's also the beads. But then, of course, the crown itself, the corona. So the opening line of John Donne's Corona, and therefore the closing line, he's speaking to Christ. He says, "Deign at my hands this crown of prayer and praise." And he says that at the beginning and at the end. And obviously he's aware of the crown of thorns as well as the crown of gold. And I found that double image of, on the one hand, the suffering of the thorn, and on the other hand, the glory. And of the two almost, that opened up the Psalter to me enormously. There's so much which is about suffering and so much is about glory, and they don't exclude one another. The suffering is sometimes made bearable because of the sense of the glory that can shine through.
And in the Psalms is the bigger picture where you start with the laments and the Psalms of real agony and suffering, and end with that great paean of praise in 150.
Yeah, 150.
So there's a bigger picture as well as a smaller one.
Yeah.
Well, my project of the Psalms really began actually in 1990. It goes a long way back, when I was staying in some friend's house in Sheffield, and they'd gone out and left me. And as one tends to do when you're in someone else's strange house, I started looking at the bookshelves, and I found this book, which was it was a confirmation present, and it was Ronald Knox's translation as Book of Psalms. And I just started reading it. And to be honest, I didn't actually get on with Ronald Knox, a great man that he was. I didn't get on with his translation. But I began to think of what I would want a translation and a book of Psalms to be like. And it took me back to when I was actually still at school. I went to Florence, and we went into the convent of San Marco and sat in each of these cells where there are these sort of wonderful Fra Angelico paintings. And you could just, those days, you could actually go and sit in each of the cells and just sort of meditate on the pictures. And that was for me, that was a huge moment in my own sort of spiritual journey. But it also, I began to, it just remained with me as an idea. And then when I was actually living just down the road from here, I started going, because I'd started writing poetry and I got interested in fact, it was a Song of Songs at the time. I wanted to investigate it further, and I went along to the Jewish Studies Centre in St Giles, and Dr. Jeremy Hughes was doing a class in Hebrew, which I sort of joined, and I began to learn a bit of Hebrew, and suddenly, back in Sheffield, all these sort of things came together, and I thought, could I produce a book which had a sort of fresh translation of the Psalms with pictures and arranging the text in a way that would allow you to meditate on the Psalms in the way that I had in those cells. And what encouraged me in that idea was that when you read the Psalms, you are in fact entering the life of an actual building, in the sense that the temple in Jerusalem, carved with cherubim and palm trees and open flowers from wall to wall, overlaid with gold, as it's described, that was the backdrop against which the Psalms were performed. And the destruction of the temple and the abolition of the musical life left the Psalms in a way as kind of orphans. I mean, you can see the orphan status of the Psalms is you can see in all the titles that are there. That's lilies, Alamoth, doves of far off terebinth, do not destroy, hind of the dawn, and also the technical terms used that are scattered through the Psalms: Higgaion, Sheminith, Maskil, Selah, which it's clear that even when the Psalms were translated into Greek, they didn't entirely understand what these terms meant. But that kind of orphan status was also an amazing seed of creativity, because people then had to think of new tunes. When Jesus and his disciples sang a psalm, it's very unlikely possible, I suppose, that was a psalm that had been the tune that had been there in Solomon's time, but probably someone had actually devised a new tune. And certainly ever since then, the Psalms has been the great source of creativity in Western culture. All the psalm settings, and then of course the translations. They first from sort of Hebrew to Greek to Latin to Coptic to all the languages of the world. Amazing creativity. But then there was also a visual creativity, because the people, the first visual creativity was in a sense to try and rebuild a sense of what the temple had been like in churches and synagogues, so that in the earliest churches in Dura Europos, the wonderful synagogue is filled with sort of paintings, and the church there, which is the earliest known church, has actually got what is probably the earliest psalm illustration. It's of Psalm 23. And so I began to think, could I do that? Could I bring all these things together in a book that had the images, it had the Psalms, but it actually, the wonderful thing about the difference between Hebrew and English is that one goes from left to right and the other goes from right to left, and so you could use that as a kind of framing thing and use the text as well to sort of frame the pictures. So that was my sort of challenge. And I sort of started doing this over as I say, back in the 1990s, and then I'd rather run out of steam when I sort of went to Sue's Psalm, what was it called?
Psalm Network.
Psalm Network, that's right. And the people there encouraged me to try and make a selection of these the books that I did. So this book was one of those. And over the last, we started in lockdown, because we couldn't do anything with the books. So we, first of all, Malcolm and I started doing a sort of YouTube conversations about the Psalms, and then Sue joined us, which brought a whole new dimension to the thing, because
free education.
Absolutely, education for both
In,
of us. And so we've been doing this for almost 2 years now, and we finally got to the end of my selection, which is Psalm 87. So what we've done in these conversations, and this is the last, this is the first one face to face, but the last one of this sort of series. So we'll end now by doing what we've been doing over the last 2 years, which is discussing a particular psalm. In this case, it's Psalm 87. So I'll first of all read you my translation, and then we'll start talking about it. So this is Psalm 87 of the sons of Korah. And so actually, if we could have the text up on the that's the first bit, and then when I come to the second bit, you could put the second. Yeah. So we'll go back to the first. Okay. Well. Yeah. Sorry, I'm confused. So here we go. Of the sons of Korah, a hymn, a song. His establishment is on holy hills. The Lord loves the gates of Zion more than all the dwellings of Jacob. Glorious things are said of you, city of God. Selah. I will record Rahab and Babel among those that know me. Look at Philistia and Tyre together with Cush. This one was born there. And of Zion, mother, it will be said, each and every one is born in her. He, the Most High, shall establish her. The Lord will write in the register of the peoples, this one was born there. Selah. So singers as dancers, all my springs are in you. So if we have the whole psalm, which is the last one, yeah, that's it. Then you can have the sort of text, which you can look at.
I'm caught because I can't see the text. It's too
Well,
too
you know
Sue
much better, and you don't have to sort of stick with my translation because you know the Hebrew much better. So now, I mean, Sue in her reception history goes through the whole reception of the psalm, and I was very interested in what you write too about the particularly. I mean, obviously, the Jewish translation of Jewish sort of commentaries and Christian commentaries take a sort of different view of this, as you'd expect. But it's interesting the way that the destruction of Jerusalem and later on the destruction of Rome both had a sort of kind of impact on those views. I wonder if you could perhaps say something about that.
Yeah, could I say something about Mother Zion first,
Yes,
which we were going
absolutely.
to talk about,
And then we in brackets.
having thought a lot about this idea of Zion as a mother, it's only in the Greek. The actual Hebrew doesn't. That's in verse 5. Doesn't actually use the word mother. The Greek adds the word mother. I think this is quite an interesting idea of Zion. Sometimes, because the city is in the feminine, Zion is usually termed in feminine terms, sometimes as a bride in Isaiah, sometimes as a harlot in Ezekiel. Sometimes we have the daughters of Zion, for example, in Psalm 9. But here we have Mother Zion, and I think this is really a very interesting idea from a Jewish perspective initially, because the Greek translation is a Jewish one, of how Zion was understood as the sort of the protector, the place of refuge, a place of safety. And obviously, if you look at, I can't see the text, I haven't got the whole text in front of me, this is the first time ever I've done anything without the text. But I think you can, in verses, I think it's 4, 5, and 6, you've got the references to being born in her, born in her. So I think the Greek thought it would be rather a good way to try and give another image of Zion as the one who gave birth to, in the first instance, to the people of Israel. But the really interesting thing that happens in Christian tradition is, so if God is a dwelling place among his people, then suddenly the idea of the idea of Mother Zion becomes attached to Mary. Mary is the one who gives birth to Jesus. And so you have a whole theology coming out of this psalm, which in the early Catholic tradition centered also on Mary as the one who, what we call Theotokos, who actually was the one who bore Jesus. And in a lot of illuminated psalters from the Greek Byzantine period and also from the West as well, you have pictures of Mary attached to this psalm. There's one wonderful one where she's actually reading the words of this psalm to Joseph, trying to explain what's happened to her. And, you know, there's a sense of humor in despite the adulation. But I think that's just an interesting extra. But Mother is a place of safety and refuge. And then back to Roger's point about the destruction of the city. Of course, the interesting thing about Egypt and Babylon, Egypt is obviously identified with the first time that the people were outside the land living as slaves. Babylon is a representation of the time when they were living in Babylon and the temple had been destroyed. And then, of course, we have the temple destroyed finally in 70 during the Roman period. And I think what Malcolm was going to ask me was about Augustine's use of the psalm in City of God. He uses verse 3 as as a sort of title page to his description of the City of God. And for Augustine, and this reminds me very much of some of the things Malcolm was saying earlier, for Augustine, the City of God is a place of eternal refuge. It's a place where all the, Rome, Babylon, all have fallen, and now, and Jerusalem too. And so now all that remains is the eternal city. And that becomes very much a Christian way of thinking. Not that it doesn't have political implications. Of course, some of you will know how Augustine's City of God influenced very much the Crusades. So it's not just about the eternal and only that, but that's the goal to which we go. And that's no surprise, therefore, that Augustine used this psalm in that way too.
And I mean, obviously, it's been, that ending about singers, it's been had a huge musical thing as well. That glorious things of thee are spoken.
Zion City.
Yes, that's right, Newton. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And again, yes, based on the same verse 3. And back to your point, Roger, about how we can try and imagine the music of the Psalms. In the Psalms Torture Network, we actually had somebody called David Mitchell who came, who tries to read music from the Hebrew. And he'd actually managed to both create rhythm, a three-beat rhythm, and melody from this psalm, and he sang it to us, and it was actually very much like plain chant because it had the breaks between each. You can picture the verses, how they break up into two parts, and he had a shofar, the horn and so on. So it was quite a dramatic moment. It was obviously, it had to be, to some extent, an imaginative moment, but you could begin to think of those Levitical singers, the Korarites, who are the ones to whom the psalm is dedicated, singing this psalm in a way that represents something like plain chant, which borrowed from the Jewish tradition. And I think that's quite an interesting way. So we do have this song coming in music in many different ways. I mean, in my book, I actually got David's permission to print out his score of Psalm 87, which if you ever pick up the book, you'll see. And just out of interest, some of you may know Sarah MacDonald. I was talking to Malcolm earlier, who was in Cambridge and at Ely too. And her father, Bob MacDonald, and you can Google this later, he's a Canadian. He's actually transliterated the entire Psalter using the same technique as David Mitchell, looking at what we call the diacritical marks in the Hebrew, looking at the jots and tittles and trying to create music from them. So if you're interested in this sort of thing, how the Psalms sounded, imaginative reconstruction, then perhaps Google I did it early just to make sure it worked. Bob MacDonald Psalms, M-A-C Donald Psalms, and you'll find his page, and you'll then be able to access some of his work that is done on transliterating the Psalms through music. And he's been very influenced by David Mitchell too. As I said, there are many people opposed to it because they feel it's not really reading the Hebrew properly, but it does, from my point of view, give you an imaginative insight as to how the Psalms might have actually been used in worship. And so much of music is in the Psalms, in the contents, in the headings, and Psalm 150 with, all three types of instruments being used at the end. So string, wind, percussion. So it's really full of music, and so not surprising it's been tried.
Well, Malcolm, I mean, in your imaginative response to the psalm, I was fascinated in your poem that you invoke Milton.
Oh, I do, yeah. So just to say something about, we mentioned Augustine already. I mean, if you think of this psalm as having had a special charge, as it were, after the destruction of the temple, because it's a hymn to Zion where the temple is. And one of the immediate things that comes from that, if you can't go outwardly and visibly to Zion, then the whole idea of an inner Zion becomes important, and all my fresh springs are in thee. So Zion becomes both the place of longing that's not there yet, but also a kind of inner sanctum in which you meet God. So Milton, there's a wonderful moment of kind of recovery. In Paradise Lost, you know that Milton had become blind by the time he even began it. And we spent the first two books of Paradise Lost in hell and darkness visible. And then in book 3, he's going to return the scene to heaven. And he says, how can I even do this? We've been in the dark for so long. And it's the first time at which he kind of brings himself into the poem and talks about his own physical blindness, because he begins with this great invocation of light. Hail, holy light, offspring of heaven. And then he says, how can I praise light? I'm blind. And then he asks instead for this inward light. And he riffs on this psalm and thinks about how in the darkness he revisits it. He revisits Zion. So I'll just read you the little bit. He says, I feel thy sovereign vital lamp, the sun, I feel the sunlight. Thou revisitest not these eyes that roll in vain to find thy piercing ray and find no dawn, so thick a drop serene hath quenched their orbs and dim suffusion you. Then he says this is great, like a psalmic yet not the more cease I to wonder whether muses haunt clear spring or shady grove or sunny hill, smit with the love of sacred song, but chief thee, Zion, and the flowery brooks beneath that wash thy hallowed feet and warbling flows. So there is Milton, seeking poetic inspiration not just from the classics and Parnassus, but feeling the Siloam's brook just under Zion. So that was very much in my mind when I got to this psalm in my own book, partly because in the previous psalm, in 86, I was wrestling, among other things, with the question of mortality, and I had type 2 diabetes, and I was therefore an at-risk person, and, I was kind of making my will to some degree. And so I'd written this thing in the earlier poem. I'd said, I need your mercy now, for I despair of any other help. The telling chimes of every passing bell might be my own. And then I say to God, lift up my soul and breathe through my poor rhymes that I might lay these lines before your throne, a frail corona, wreathed of David, of fading flowers, to set against the gold of David's crown, wrought in the passion of my passing hours. O you who raised me from the depths of hell, kindle these lines with all your quickening powers. Now, I knew that line, because it was the end of my 80s, was going to be the beginning of the 87. Kindle these lines with them. And at that point, suddenly the figure of Milton struggling in the dark came to me. So, should I read that?
Yes, I think we'd be lovely to hear that. And then we'll perhaps have a little time for one or two questions. But perhaps I can just, before you do, I mean, the reason that I particularly wanted to end this little collection with this psalm was that of all the, I was saying that it was kind of recreating the whole book of Psalms was this great sort of seed of creativity recreating the temple. And particularly I was thinking of the golden cherubim that line the whole temple. So that the image here that I've got is of those kind of golden cherubim lining the thing. And of course it ends with this glorious verse about all my springs are in you, which is just such a, I mean, in a way, it's quite. It kind of shows the way the psalmist Zion is becoming this great sort of metaphorical thing. Because it's like Psalm 46. There is a stream that makes glad the city of God. Well, there's no stream in Jerusalem. There's no river there. All my springs. This Gihon spring is outside the walls of Jerusalem, but yet it becomes this great sort of, which of course, when Jesus stands up and says,
out of his belly shall flow water. Yeah, and in fact, the other line that I think about when I'm reading this is, I forget which of the Psalms it is, it might be 81, where it says, blessed is the man in whose heart are the highways to Zion.
Yes, 84.
And the idea that as well as the Zion out there, there's the Zionists. And I think that is also then going through the veil, he finds the spring. That line, all thy springs rise in thee, was key for me when I came to write.
Well, let's hear, Malcolm, your poem.
So this is my take on Psalm 87. Again, these are not translations or paraphrases. It's like a prayer diary in poetry about a contemporary Christian's journey. But as I'd said, I talked about the effort of writing this thing, so I take that up again. So the last line of the last verse was, kindle these lines with all your quickening powers. So that's how we start. Kindle these lines with all your quickening powers, for all my springs of life arise from you. And like blind Milton in his midnight hours, I visit Zion's hill in dreams. I view Siloam's sacred brook and bathe my soul in those pure streams that cleanse me and renew my vision and my purpose. Make me whole and sound again. The city of my God shines clear once more upon his holy hill. My feet are set upon the royal road that leads me through these shadowlands until I hear the trumpets and set down my load beside the river bank and drink my fill from that deep well of light at last and hear my Saviour's words of welcome. All is well. So it's that. You see, there's a bit of Bunyan in there as well.
Well, that's lovely. I said we'd have, I think all is well is a good note to end on. I said we'd have some questions, but actually I now see we've got to 1:30, so I think do come up, and I would love to have made this more of a dialogue, but I think we've run out of time. But we don't have to be out of the church here, so we'll still be here. So do if you want to talk more about the Psalms, do come and do that. As we've got some, I think, more of the Quarantine Quatrains and some of the other books at the back there as well. So thank you both. Thank you, St Andrews, and thank you all for coming.
Thank you.